Welcome to Unit 4, and our topic today is properties of parallelograms and other quadrilaterals. The definition of all quadrilaterals is that it has exactly four sides, and the sum of the interior angles is always 360 degrees. So you should have your notes out in front of you, and you should type in four sides and the sum of the and 360 degrees for your interior angles. Let's look at our parallelogram properties. For a parallelogram, it has two sets of opposite sides that are parallel. Two sets of opposite sides are congruent. That means they are the same. Your opposite angles are congruent, in other words, they equal each other. And your consecutive angles, the ones next to each other, are supplemental. That's what the SPP stands for, which means that they equal 180 degrees. The diagonals bisect each other. In other words, the diagonals cut each other in half. And from the diagonals, you form two congruent triangles. In other words, you form two triangles that have the same measurements. Here's our rhombus. The rhombus has all the properties of a parallelogram as well as four congruent sides. In other words, all the sides are equal to each other. The diagonals bisect the angles, okay? So that means that they cut the angles in half, and your diagonals are actually perpendicular to each other. All right, let's look at the rectangle. The rectangle has all the properties of a parallelogram plus four right angles. All the corner angles are 90 degrees, and your diagonals are congruent. In other words, the diagonals equal each other, okay? Then for a square, the square has all the properties of a parallelogram plus all the properties of your rectangle plus all the properties of the rhombus. So the square has it all. Let's take a look at our last three shapes. The trapezoid. The trapezoid has one pair of parallel sides. Okay? Then the median of the trapezoid is parallel to the bases and half the sum of the bases. The isosceles trapezoid has more properties. It has at least one pair of parallel sides. The legs are congruent. The base angles are congruent. The diagonals are congruent. And the opposite angles are supplemental, which means the opposite angles are 180 degrees. Okay? The diagonals that are congruent, yeah, the base angles are congruent, which means they're the same. And then our last figure is the kite. And the kite has two distinct pairs of adjacent sides that are congruent. So their congruent sides are together, they touch each other. They have one pair of opposite angles that are congruent. They have one diagonal creates two isosceles triangle. One diagonal creates two congruent triangles. One diagonal bisects two angles, and the diagonals bisect each other as well as being perpendicular to each other. Diagonals are perpendicular. Okay? So those are our properties. So this is what your handout should look like, and you should have filled in the properties as we went along. We're going to take a look at more closely the properties of parallelograms and how to solve the problems. So for your parallelogram, a quadrilateral is with two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. Okay? And so we could write parallelogram ABCD, or we could use the symbol and write using the symbol ABCD, or we can shorten parallelogram and write ABCD. Okay? The parallelogram opposite sides theorem states in a parallelogram the opposite sides are congruent and they are parallel. So let's take a look at example 1. We can solve for x and y because of this. So we would have 4x plus 10 is equal to 42. So that means 4x is equal to 32. So what is my x value? That's right, x is equal to 8. We can then set it up because the opposite sides are congruent that 2y minus 12 is equal to 20. So what would be my value for y? That's correct. The y would be equal to 16. So by using the opposites are the same, are congruent, we can set these up to solve. Then the parallelogram opposite angles theorem says this, that your opposite angles are congruent or the same. So we can use this to solve for 2x. So because these angles are the opposite, then we know they equal each other. So 2x is equal to 50. So my x value is equal to, that is correct, 25. Again, in this problem, we're still using the opposite sides are congruent. So y plus 3 equals 18. So my y value is, that's right, it's 15. Okay, so in this, that the parallelogram, the consecutive angles theorem, that means the angles that are on the same side are equal to 180 degrees. So angle 1 and angle 2, if you add them together, they're 180 degrees. Angle 2 and angle 3, if you add together, they're 180 degrees. And angle 3 and angle 4, you add them together for 180 degrees, and angle 4 and angle 1 add together for 180 degrees. So we call these consecutive angles or supplementary. So we're going to use this property, for example, 3. So we can take 3x plus 120 equals 180. So what would my x value be? Okay, so that's correct. Your x is going to wind up being 20. All right, another neat thing about parallelograms is that the diagonals bisect each other, cutting them in half. Okay, so we're going to use this. So in this case, we have 5x minus 8 for one side, 2x plus 10 for the other side, so we can set them equal to each other because we know that they're along the same diagonal and they've been cut in half, or that line has been cut in half. So we're going to solve for the x's, and so my x is going to be equal to what? That's right, 6. So in a parallelogram, we have opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent. That means they're equal to each other. The opposite angles are congruent. They equal each other. Consecutive angles are supplementary. That means they equal 180. Diagonals bisect each other. These properties must be memorized in order for you to do the problems. Thank you for your participation. The end.